Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second of our webinars hosted by the RCN Southwest region. Tonight's subject is statutory leave for the independent staff. Our next webinar, which is going to be on the 7th of September, will be on statutory pay. So please, after tonight, if you get the opportunity, please sign up for that one. I'm sure that will be an interesting discussion. Our presenter this evening is Barry Hutchinson, you can see on the screen there, who's our National Officer for Employment Relations. So after Barry's presentation, there will be the opportunity to put questions. The questions you can post in the chat. You can do that throughout Barry's presentation if a question comes to mind. And then what we'll do is there's some time, as I say, towards the end of Barry's presentation, we'll do some questions and hopefully some answers for you. The other thing that I will add at this point is towards the end of today's meeting, we will be placing an evaluation link into the chat. Please click onto that and complete an evaluation. And from this, we will be sending you an attendance certificate for tonight's webinar. Any questions, as I say, please put up into the chat and we'll endeavour to cover as many as we can. If we don't have time to cover all the questions this evening, what we'll do is I will take the details, pass them on, and we'll independently reply to you. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Barry now, and I'll come back to you in a short while.
Thanks, Tony. Good evening, everyone. As Tony said, my name's Barry Hutchinson. I work in the RCN's Employment Relations Department as a national officer. That means I look after RCN members at a national level. I work as part of the Independent Health and Social Care team, which includes civil service as well as health. My background, just quickly, I'm a registered nurse myself. I qualified in mental health, have worked predominantly in care of the elderly, but have worked in the health service, in the independent sector, and in local government social care. And then for my sins, many years ago, I left nursing and I requalified as an employment solicitor and was in private practice for 15 years before I joined the RCN. That just gives you a little bit of background about me. As Tony said as well, this evening's webinar is about statutory leave that those of you working in the independent sector are entitled to. So this evening, we'll be looking at the difference between statutory leave and contractual leave. I'll be going through the different types of statutory leave that is available to those of you in the independent sector, and we'll be discussing the eligibility criteria for each type of leave. One thing I will say that we will not be doing is talking about pay. As Tony said, the webinar on the 7th of September will look at the corresponding pay to the leave that we're discussing tonight. So I think in the first instance, we need to differentiate between statutory leave and contractual leave. So what we're talking about tonight is statutory leave, and it's that leave which the law says you are entitled to. Contractual leave is leave that you can agree with your employer, which would form part of your terms and conditions of employment and would be reflected in your employment contract or in your employer's policy. We're not talking about that contractual leave tonight. As I say, it's statutory leave. Now, it may not be recorded in your employment contract, and your employer may well not have a policy. They don't have to, because the law trumps your employment contract. And because the law says you're entitled to this leave, then your employer has to allow you to take it if you qualify for the leave. The other thing that we need to be clear about is that your employer cannot give you less leave than the law says you are entitled to, but your employer could give you more if they wanted to. If they wanted to be more generous than the basic allowance that the law says you can, then your employer could. So you may want to check when you get to work, your employer's policies and procedures. You may want to check your employment contract to see if your employer gives you more than we're going to be talking about tonight. These are the types of leave that we're going to be discussing. Maternity, adoption, paternity, shared parental leave, and individual parental leave, and dependence leave. They are all about supporting employees with family life. Parental bereavement leave obviously is about supporting parents who have suffered a bereavement. Annual leave is something that everybody is entitled to, as is sick leave. So the majority of these are in relation to parents or the partners of parents. And when I say partner, we're talking about civil partners, husband and wives, or people who live together in a family unit. So the first one we're looking at is maternity leave. Now, the entitlement to maternity leave is up to 52 weeks in total. The first 26 weeks are known as ordinary maternity leave, and then the second lot of 26 weeks is known as additional maternity leave. Now, the distinction is historical. It doesn't really matter today, but in the past, the entitlement to ordinary maternity leave was different to additional maternity leave. And the right to take ordinary maternity leave was different to the right to take additional maternity leave. But a few years back, the government abolished those differences, but we still retained the titles. And most people who work in employment relations still know maternity leave as ordinary maternity leave and additional maternity leave. But it is in effect a total of 52 weeks to be taken. Now, maternity leave is what's known as a day one entitlement. That means you don't have to have any qualifying length of employment. So that the first day that you start working for your employer is the first day that you become entitled to statutory maternity leave. However, to be able to qualify for the leave and to be able to take the leave, you've got to tell your employer at least 15 weeks before the week of the child's birth. You've got to tell them the date that the baby is due, the date you want to start your maternity leave, and the date that you are thinking about returning to work. Now, the first two are absolutes. You must tell your employer the date the baby is due, and you must tell him or her the date you want to start your maternity leave. You don't always have to tell them the date that you plan to return to work. If you don't tell your employer the date that you plan to return to work, then your employer must assume you are taking all 52 weeks. Your employer then must write back to you to confirm the dates of your leave, to confirm that they understand the dates that you're going to be taking. If your employer asks you for proof of pregnancy, then you must provide it. Now, that proof is usually in the form of a certificate called a MAT B1. That's MAT B1 certificate. The certificate's given that name simply by the code that the government stationery office allocated to it. But it's a certificate that you can get from your midwife or your doctor, and it will include the date on which the baby is due. It also include the fact that you are pregnant. You could also get a simple letter from your doctor or midwife, and that would do the same job as the MAT B1 certificate, but the letter must include the fact that you're pregnant and the date that the baby is due to be born. So assuming that you've done everything that you've got to do to tell your employer, then you take a maternity leave. Now, it's generally up to you when you want to start your maternity leave, how much leave you want to take and when you want to finish it. There are, however, some requirements, some restrictions set out in law, and these set out these restrictions. So the earliest you can start maternity leave is 11 weeks before the week in which your baby is due. However, you must start maternity leave the day after the baby is born. So if your baby is premature, if your baby is born early, then your leave must start the day after the birth. You must also take at least 2 weeks maternity leave after the child is born. And those 2 weeks are called compulsory maternity leave. The law says that you have to have time to recover from birth before you go back to work, and it's a minimum of 2 weeks. Now, you can change your leave start date, but you must give your employer 28 days notice of the new date. And you can change the date that you were planning to return to work. But again, you must give your employer notice. And to return to work early, you've got to give your employer 8 weeks notice. Now, if you were planning on returning to work early, but you couldn't give 8 weeks because you only had, say, 6 weeks of your maternity leave left, then you've got to tell the employer as soon as you can when you're going to return to work and give them as much notice as you possibly can. But if you've got more than 8 weeks left at the end of your leave, you've got to give the 8 weeks notice. Moving now on to adoption leave. Again, this is 52 weeks in total. And again, because of history, the first 26 are known as ordinary adoption leave, and the second 26 weeks are known as additional adoption leave. Now, there are 2 types of adoption as far as statutory leave is concerned. There are UK adoptions and overseas adoptions, and the rules are slightly different depending on whether you're adopting a child within the UK or whether you're adopting a child from outside of the UK. So assuming you're adopting a child within the UK, you've got to tell your employer within 7 days of you being matched with a child for adoption, the expected date or the actual date that the child is going to be placed with you. Again, the date you want your leave to start, and again, how much leave you plan to take and when you're planning to come back. To qualify for adoption leave with an overseas adoption, you've got to tell your employer within 28 days of getting notification of the adoption, the date that you got the notification and when you expect the child to arrive in the UK. You've then got to tell your employer within 28 days of the child arriving in the UK, the actual date that the child arrived. And again, you've got to tell your employer at least 28 days before you start the leave, how much leave you plan to take and when you're going to start it. Now, for both cases, if your employer asks you for proof of adoption, like maternity, if they ask you for proof of pregnancy, well, the same applies. If you ask you for proof of adoption, you must provide that proof of adoption. And the usual type of proof for UK adoptions is what's called the matching certificate. Once you've been matched for a child to adopt, then the UK Adoption Agency or the UK Adoption Authorities will issue with what's called a matching certificate. And that's the proof of adoption for within the UK. If you are adopting for overseas and you haven't got that matching certificate, then a letter from an official body, the organisation that's arranging the adoption, will be the same as the matching certificate. And I think the other thing that you need to be clear about is that you can't have adoption leave if you're adopting a stepchild or a family member, or if you're going through a private adoption. Now, a private adoption is usually a private arrangement between 2 people that doesn't involve UK adoption agency, doesn't involve an official organisation. So in those circumstances, you will not qualify for adoption leave. So to take your adoption leave, it can start on the day that you have been matched with a child by a UK adoption agency, on the date that the child starts living with you, or up to 14 days before the expected date if you're adopting within the UK, or when the child arrives in the UK, or within 28 days of that date of arrival for overseas adoptions. You can change the date you want your adoption leave to start, but you've got to give your employer at least 28 days notice before the original start date or the new start date, whichever is earlier. So, for example, if you wanted to start your adoption leave within next 4 weeks' time, then if you haven't got 28 days, then you've got to give it before the new start date, whichever you can meet the criteria for. With regards to returning to work, again, you've got to give your employer at least 8 weeks notice if you want to change the date of your return. And if you haven't got 8 weeks left in your adoption leave, then you've got to give them notice as soon as possible and as much notice that you can of the new return to work date. The next type of leave is paternity leave. And this is leave that is granted to the partner of the person giving birth to a child, or the partner of a person who is adopting a child. And I specifically say person rather than saying man or woman or father or mother, because the law is gender neutral, and it doesn't assume that all couples are typical male and female. The law accepts that couples can be two males, two females, a couple who are not gender specific, whatever. So we talk about the person. So it's not just about a man and a woman being husband and wife and a father and a mother. And as it says there, to qualify for paternity leave, you need to be the child's father or the husband or partner of the child's mother, or that's in cases of birth child, or the child's adopter or the husband or partner of the child adopter. And partner means just simply two people who are in a relationship. You must also have responsibility for the child's upbringing. So you must be involved in the care of the child. And you must have at least 26 weeks continuous employment with your employer. And the date at which the 26 weeks is calculated is a little bit complicated. In the cases of a birth, it's 26 weeks by the end of the 15th week before the child is due to be born. With adoption, it's 26 weeks by the end of the week in which you are matched for a child for UK adoptions, or the week in which the child will arrive in the UK for overseas adoptions. So it's not just 26 weeks full stop, it's 26 weeks plus whatever else the law requires, so exactly 15 weeks before the expected childbirth. So you need to be careful about calculating the date at which you would accrue 26 weeks continuous leave. And if in any doubt, ask. When I come to the end of the presentation, there are some organisations details given where you can get advice about leave and entitlement. But calculating that 26 weeks continuous employment can be complicated. So if in doubt, don't try and do it yourself. Seek professional advice. Next slide, please. Now, to take your paternity leave in a birth situation, you've got to tell the employer at least 15 weeks before the week in which the child is expected to be born, the date that the child is expected to be born, how much leave you want to take, and when you want your leave to start. In cases of adoption, you've got to tell your employer no later than 7 days after you or your partner are notified of being matched with the child, the date you were notified, the expected week that the child is going to be placed with you, how much leave you want to take, and when you want your leave to start. So taken leave, if it is in relation to a birth, then the paternity leave must start either on the date of birth or an agreed number of days after the birth, or an agreed number of days after the expected week that the child is born. And those agreed days are the number of days agreed with your employer. So you and your employer need to have a conversation when it's about taking paternity leave. If it's adoption, then your paternity leave must start either on the date that the child is placed with you, or again, an agreed number of dates after the date of placement, or on the date the child arrives in the UK, if it's an overseas adoption, or an agreed number of dates after the child arrives. So again, a conversation needs to be had with your employer to agree the dates on which your leave are going to start. Whichever date that your leave starts, whichever leave it is in relation to, whether it's a birth or an adoption, paternity leave must finish within 56 days of a birth, or the due date if the baby is born early, or 56 days of the date of the child is placed with you or arrive in the UK in the cases of adoption. So you've only got that 56-day period in which to take the paternity leave, and your paternity leave is either 1 or 2 weeks. It must be taken in those 1 or 2 week blocks. If you decide you only want to take 1 week and you return to work, you're not then able to take the second week. So you need to also decide before you start your leave whether you're going to take 1 or 2 weeks in total. The next leave that you're entitled to in law is leave which is called shared parental leave. Now this is where things start to get even more complicated. So I'll try and explain it in simple terms, because it's even complicated for those of us who work in employment relations full time. But shared parental leave is about partners sharing maternity leave or adoption leave. So it's about 2 people sharing one person's entitlement to maternity leave or adoption leave. Now, if you remember, as I said earlier, maternity leave and adoption leave is up to 52 weeks in total. So there's quite a bit of leave that a couple can share between them to take time off after the birth or after the adoption. To qualify for shared parental leave, you need to have responsibility for the child. And that responsibility would be either with husband, wife, a civil partner, or an adopter, or the child's other parent, or a partner that you live with as if you were in a family relationship. Also, you or your partner must be eligible for either statutory maternity leave, statutory maternity pay, or maternity allowance. Now, I'm not going to talk about maternity pay and maternity allowance tonight because I'll be talking about them on the 7th of September. In the cases of adoption, you or your partner must be eligible for either statutory adoption leave or statutory adoption pay. If both of you are not eligible for any of them, then you can't take shared parental leave. Likewise, you must have been continuously employed by your employer for at least 26 weeks by the last day of either the 15th week before the week the child is expected to be born in, or the week you are matched with a child for adoption. So if you remember back to the beginning of the presentation, when I said that maternity leave and adoption leave are day one rights, that means that you don't have to have any continuous employment to take that leave. You're entitled to it from the first day of employment. If you do not qualify for maternity leave or adoption leave, but you are taking shared parental leave because your partner qualifies, then your partner has the right from day one because they're entitled to the maternity leave or the adoption leave. But if you don't have the right to either one of those, then your right to shared parental leave is dependent on you having 26 continuous weeks employment. It is complicated in calculating these dates and your entitlement. So again, if in doubt, get specialist advice. So taking shared parental leave, before you can share either the maternity leave or the adoption leave with your partner, the partner must have taken at least 2 weeks maternity leave or 2 weeks adoption leave. So even though maternity leave and adoption leave are 52 weeks, you can only share 50 weeks of those 52 weeks, because as you may remember, as I earlier said, in the case of maternity, there is that 2-week compulsory maternity leave. So the person giving birth to the child must take 2 weeks maternity leave. The person adopting the child must take 2 weeks adoption leave, and then the two of you can share the remaining 50 weeks. But also, before you can take it, the child's mother, or the child's birth parent, or the adopter has to have ended their maternity leave or their adoption leave by either returning to work or giving their employer notice of the date when they're going to end their leave, or they've ended their maternity pay allowance or statutory pay, so they've stopped taking their statutory pay, because you can't take shared leave if the other person is still taking the maternity leave or the adoption leave. They've got to stop doing that so that you can then share the balance. Again, to take the shared parental leave, you've got to give your employer 8 weeks notice of the date that you want the leave to start. And you must also provide your employer with a declaration that your partner meets the requirements for shared parental leave, because the two of you are sharing it. You've both got to be entitled to it. So that if your employer wants proof that your partner is entitled to that leave, then you must provide that proof. And you've also got to remain employed by your employer while you take the leave. Now, you can take the leave all in one go, or you can split it into 2 or 3 separate blocks. But we're talking about taking it in weeks. You don't have the right in law to take shared parental leave in days, but your employer can allow you to take it in days if they agree. But if they don't agree, then you have no right to take it in days. It must be taken in blocks of weeks or all in one go. And if both parents of the child are taking shared parental leave, then they can both take it at the same time. We also have what is called individual parental leave, or it's sometimes known as unpaid parental leave, because as you will find out on the 7th, this is one of the leaves that doesn't have any statutory pay to go with it. So you will see it called individual parental leave or unpaid parental leave or just parental leave. Now, this is leave which you can take to look after a child. You're entitled to take up to 18 weeks for each child under the age of 18. Now, it's 18 weeks per child, not 18 weeks per employer. So if you change employment during the first 18 years of that child's life, your new employer is entitled to request proof from your old employer as to whether you've taken any parental leave or not. So if you have taken parental leave in one job and then moved to the next, your new employer will want to know how many weeks you've taken, because the maximum 18 weeks applies to the child and not to the employer. And again, out of those 18 weeks, you only have the right to take up to 4 weeks in any 1 year. To qualify for the individual parental leave, you must have at least 1 year's continuous employment with your employer. And to take the leave, you have to take it in whole weeks rather than days, unless your employer agrees that you can take it in days, or unless your child is disabled. So if you have a disabled child, then you can take that leave in days and your employer cannot stop you. They cannot insist that it's in weeks if your child is disabled. If you do have a disabled child and you are wanting to take individual parental leave, I would suggest that you check with a specialist whether your child is disabled or not, because disability is not defined by a doctor. It's not defined by a nurse. Disability is defined in law. So you'll need to speak to somebody who's got some legal knowledge about the legal definition of disability. I'm not going to go into that tonight because it's not necessary for the purposes of this webinar, but I just raise it in case you do have a disabled child and you are thinking about taking parental leave and you want to take it in days. It is worth speaking to somebody just to check that your child meets the definition of disabled. You've also got to give your employer at least 21 days notice before taking the leave, and you've got to specify the start and finish dates when you give your employer notice to take the leave. Now, dependence leave is a reasonable amount of time to deal with a family or dependent emergency. The amount of time is not specified in law, but it is to deal with an emergency. So it is short-term leave, and we're talking about matters of hours or possibly 1 day at the most. But we're not looking at 2, 3, 4 days or a week or a couple of weeks. If that was the kind of leave you were thinking about, then you'd have to be looking at, say, parental leave for a child. With regards to dependent, the law says that the dependent could be spouse, partner, a child, a grandchild, your parent, or even somebody who depends on you for their care. So a friend may be living with you while they're recuperating from an operation, for example, and you would qualify for dependence leave if there was an emergency that arose in relation to that friend to help them resolve the emergency. Now, emergency again is not defined specifically in law. There are court judgments which define what an emergency could be, but we're talking about things like your child's at school and they become ill at school, so you need to take some time off work to go home, go to school, collect your child, take them home and make arrangements for them to be looked after. Or your husband could be involved in a car crash and you need to go to hospital, or your wife might go into labour and she wants you there by her side while she's giving birth, or your father might be in daycare and the day centre closes for the day. So there are those kind of short-term emergencies where you need time off to make arrangements, longer-term arrangements, or you need time off just to deal with that emergency for a couple of hours. So to take dependence leave, you need to tell your employer as soon as possible that you need to take time off and how long you think you might be off for. Now, ideally, you should tell your employer before you take the leave, but because this is a leave for dealing with emergencies, then there are going to be occasions where you can't tell your employer before you need the time off. You might be at work, you might not be able to find the person in charge, but you might have to go and deal with an emergency. So if you can't tell your employer before you take the time off, you've got to tell them as soon as you possibly can after you've left work. You can't have dependent leave if you know about the situation in advance. So if, for example, you're at work, I don't know, on a Wednesday, and you get a phone call from your child's school to say that the school is going to be closing for a couple of days next week. Well, on that Wednesday, you wouldn't be entitled to take dependence leave because the situation isn't going to be arising for another week. So you know that, but you know that in advance, you can't take dependence leave because it's not an emergency if you know it in advance. So you'd need to think about taking other leave to deal with the situation when your child's school was closed the following week. Parental bereavement leave is 2 weeks leave for a child who dies below the age of 18 years or is stillborn after 24 weeks of pregnancy. It's about giving parents the time off work to deal with the child's death, make necessary arrangements. You can choose to take the 2 weeks together, or you can take them as 2 separate weeks, or you can decide to only take 1 week. To qualify for the bereavement leave for a birth child, at the time of the child's death or the stillbirth, you must have been the child's parent or the partner of the child's parent, or if it was a death after birth, you had the child living with you at home for 4 continuous weeks up to the date of the death, and you had responsibility for the child's care during that time. In cases of an adopted child, at the time of the child's death, you must have been the child's adoptive parent, or you must have been the partner of the child's adoptive parent. If a child dies in a case of adoption, but before the adoption order is granted, then you will still qualify for leave if the child was placed for you for adoption and the placement wasn't disrupted or stopped. Now, if you are adopting from outside the United Kingdom and the court order has not yet been made to confirm that adoption and the child has died, then you may still qualify for leave if the child was living with you after it came into the United Kingdom and you had received official notification confirming that you were going to adopt. So that you may not have got the order finalising the adoption, but you've had notification that you were going to adopt. To take the parental bereavement leave, you've got to tell your employer the date of the child's death or stillbirth, when you want the leave to start, and how much leave you're taking. Again, you can start the leave after the date of the death or the stillbirth, but it must be finished within 56 weeks. And if you take leave up to 8 weeks after the child's death or the stillbirth, you've got to tell your employer you're taking leave before you would have started work on the first day of leave. If you're taking leave after 8 weeks after the child's death or birth, you've got to give your employer at least 1 week's notice before taking leave. So just to be clear, if you want to take leave within 8 weeks of the child's death or stillbirth, you must tell your employer you're starting leave before the first day that you would have been at work that you're going to be on leave. If it's in weeks 9 to 56, then you've got to give your employer at least a week's notice. Annual leave is up to 5.6 weeks for you to take time off work and do whatever you want. It's about rest and recuperation. So 5.6 weeks, it depends on how many days you're working a week. So if you're working, as we say there, 3 days a week, then 5.6 weeks could equal 16.8 days. If you work 5 days a week, then 5.6 weeks will equal 28 days. But you can't have more than 28 days. So if you were working 6 days a week, 5.6 weeks would equal 33.6 days, but you still can only have 28 days leave. So it's anything up to 28 days leave calculated by the number of days you work per week multiplied by 5.6. Your employer should have a designated leave year. Most employers do. Some it's the 1st of January to the 31st December. Others it's a financial year, 1st of April to the 31st of March, and they must specify that leave year in your contract. If your employer doesn't have a designated leave year, then your leave year starts on the day that you started employment. During your first leave year, you will accrue annual leave at a rate of 1/12 of your full leave entitlement for each month employed. So you will accrue 1/12 of 5.6 weeks for every month you're employed. Once you've completed 1 year's employment, then from day 1 of year 2, your entitlement is 5.6 weeks. To take the leave, you're supposed to give your employer notice. And the notice that you give your employer must be at least twice the amount of leave you want to take plus 1 day. So if you want to take 1 week's leave, it would be 2 weeks and 1 day. If you wanted to take 2 days leave, it would be 5 days. Your employer can refuse to grant you annual leave, but they've got to have very good reasons. And if your employer refuses to let you take leave, or your employer cancels your leave once it's been booked, they must let you take all of your leave before the end of the leave year. And if your employer wants to cancel your leave, then they've got to give you notice. And the notice they have to give you to cancel your leave is the amount of leave you're wanting to take plus 1 day. So 2 weeks leave, it would be 2 weeks plus 1 day notice. 8 days leave, it would be 9 days. If you become ill when you're on annual leave, then you can go on sick leave and you would then get the remainder of that leave take another time when you were ill. If you become leave before you started if you become sick, before you start your annual leave, you can cancel your annual leave and reschedule it. If you are off sick at the end of the annual leave year and you haven't taken all 5.6 weeks, then your employer has to allow you to carry forward up to 20 days untaken leave into the next leave year. Likewise, if you can't take all of your annual leave because of maternity leave or adoption leave or shared parental leave, your employer should allow you to carry up to 28 days into the next leave year. Sick leave, I think as the name suggests, is time off work when you're too ill to work. To qualify for sick leave, you must provide your employer with proof that you're ill. Now, during the first 7 days of sickness, you would self-certify that you are too ill to work. Most employers will have a self-certificate, but a letter, an email, a phone call is sufficient. After 7 days, so from day 8, you must give your employer what's called a fit note. And the fit note will certify that you are not fit for work. Any of those people that's listed on that slide can give a fit note. GP, nurse, therapists, pharmacists, they can all issue a fit note if you're too ill for work. If you're off sick, usually for more than 4 weeks, then you are considered to be on long-term sick leave. Now, this is one of the only leaves where the employer could dismiss you for being on long-term leave. It would have to be a last resort, and before they could dismiss you fairly, they must consult with you about your health, when it might improve, when you could come back to work, and they must also consult with you about whether you need to return to work into a different job or on different terms and conditions, or whether you want to return part-time or doing something less stressful, or whether you need another job with training. Because if they don't do any of that, then if they were to dismiss you because you were on long-term sick leave, then your dismissal would be unfair. And if you find yourself in those circumstances, contact RCN for advice and support about an unfair dismissal. Don't just accept it, because your employer has to jump through a lot of hoops before they can fairly dismiss somebody who is on long-term sick. And just to end, then these are some of the organisations who will provide you with support and help. I'm not going to read, you can see who they are, and they're in the slides, so you can contact any of these, but I would suggest the first people you contact is RCN Direct if you're an RCN member to get advice on any of the leaves. So that's all I've got to say tonight about leave. As I say, on the 7th of September, we'll be talking about the pay you're entitled to when you're off leave.
While we're here, we just wanted to take this opportunity. We do realise that people on the call tonight may or may not be members of the RCN. If you are a member, thank you very much. If you're not, we're hoping that you can get the opportunity from what the information we're going to share with you now to join us. And for those of you that are members currently, please pass on to colleagues if they're not members, because I know lots of people join the RCN mainly for workplace support. But one of the things that we do try to educate all our members is the actual main services the RCN provide, and it is a bit small on there, so I'm not going to read word for word, but I'll just give you the highlights. So I did mention workplace support, which is very, very important, especially if you need support if things are not going the way you'd hoped. Alongside this, we have a professional development section. And as a professional body, we do support lifelong development with access to RCN's learning, nursing, health and social care learning resources. We have Europe's largest nursing library, we have forums and we have networks. Alongside this, we can offer legal advice. We have comprehensive support and information for you. And we do have the largest in-house legal team. So again, you'll speak directly with our legal team should you need that support and guidance going forward. Alongside that, we actually can support you. We have emotional and practical support. We can offer immigration advice. We can offer welfare guidance. So if you're suffering from any financial challenges, we can offer advice and support there. We offer career coaching. A lot of our members, are looking to develop themselves, and we can offer that. We can offer CV writing and preparing for interviews and career planning. We offer telephone counselling. Again, a lot of our members are not aware of this, but if you're going through a tough time and you do need some guidance and someone to talk to, we do offer a counselling service. We offer peer support for our members with disabilities, and we also offer a handy guide to common English expressions. And it's things that we take for granted, but actually we are there to offer that support as well. And finally, we can offer careers advice. We have an extensive nursing department and careers resource for helpful guidance on careers planning. As a member, you can access all this through My RCN. And if any of you haven't had the opportunity to go in to look at My RCN, please do. You only need to cast it 5 minutes here and there. There's so much on our website, so much we can provide for you in information and development for you should you wish to go that route. So please take this away and mention it to colleagues, mention it to friends, all nursing staff, as someone once said to me, the whole nursing family. So whether you're registered nurse, whether you're healthcare support, student nurses, please go onto our website and take the opportunity to gain some guidance from that. So it's My RCN. If you haven't registered, please register and connect to join that. And also, if you do have an opportunity, please link locally with your local branch. Every region has branches, and they are more than happy to liaise with you. Again, your local branch information will be available on the RCN website via My RCN. So I'm going to take this opportunity now to go back to Barry. I can see we do have a question, and we do have some time remaining. So please, any questions that you can, that you might think, oh, I should ask this, please pop it in the question now, and we'll look at that for you. The first one is, am I still eligible for annual leave even if I am bank staff?
Bank staff are slightly unusual situation. You would need to check your contract first to determine whether you are just bank staff, in that you are on, say, a 0 hours contract, which means that you will only get work when the employer offers you work and you accept it, as opposed to perhaps thinking that you're bank staff, but the employer's got to give you, say, 1 shift a week to work. If you are genuinely bank staff and you are on 0 hours contract, yes, you are still entitled to the equivalent of 5.6 weeks, but how you calculate that amount is different than it would be if you were a permanent employee or you worked a permanent number of hours. So what you have to do is take what's called a reference period, look at how many hours somebody has worked on average per week during that reference period, and then use that figure to calculate the amount of annual leave that they would be entitled to. It's not easy, it is complicated. So I would suggest that if you are bank staff and you are working bank hours, you would be entitled to some annual leave, but I would suggest if you're a member of the RCN, you contact RCN Direct so that they can help you calculate how much leave you would be entitled to. If you haven't worked any hours during a reference period, then you wouldn't be entitled to any annual leave, because annual leave is paid time off work to rest and recuperate. So if you've not had any work, then you wouldn't be entitled to that time off. So you need to check. So I would suggest you contact RCND in those circumstances.
Thanks, Barry. Just as we've got a few minutes available, I'm just going to ask Ben to pop in the chat for us the evaluation for this evening, and a reminder that if you do complete that for us, we'd really appreciate it. And once we've received that, as I said earlier, you will be receiving a certificate of attendance for this evening's webinar. I'm going to refer back to Barry and say, Barry, is there any kind of generic statutory leave concerns that we have at the RCN, or we have a kind of continuing referral come to us, people worried about statutory leave issues locally?
Yeah, I think there's usually 2 problem areas. I think that the 2 most common areas are people who are on sick leave and have been for what we call long term, so it's usually sort of 4 weeks or more, and the employer is talking about ending their employment. That's one of the most common areas where we get contacted. And I would say, without a doubt, if your employer is even hinting at thinking about terminating your employment because you are too ill to work, then contact RCN Direct, get advice, get the support of an RCN officer, because even though your employer could, as I said earlier, they have to jump through several hoops in order for any dismissal to be fair. If they don't follow the fair process that's set out in law, if they don't have good reason for not holding your job or offering you new employment or offering you training or looking at reducing your hours, if they don't do any of that, then it's going to be an unfair dismissal. So you need to contact the RCN and get advice. That's one of the common areas. The other thing that we get asked quite a bit, people who are on maternity leave and adoption leave, and they take the full 52 weeks, and they want to come back to work, and the employer says, not letting you come back, or your job's gone. Well, they can't. If you take maternity leave and adoption leave, even if you take the 52 weeks, your employer has got to allow you to return to the job you had before you went on maternity leave. It is the absolute right to return to the same job if you're returning after the 26 weeks ordinary maternity leave. If you're returning after what we called the additional maternity leave, that's the second 26 weeks, then again, you have the absolute right to return to work. And in the first instance, it should be into the same job. But if the same job that you had before you went on leave is not available, then they've got to find you another job, which is almost the same as the one you had. So there's no material difference. So for example, if you were on maternity leave and you went back in week 25, you've got to go back into the same job. If you went back to work in week 36, but there had been a redundancy situation at work, for example, and your job no longer exists because the job was redundant, then your employer's got to find you another job on equal terms and conditions, and as much like the first job that you had as is reasonably practical. So if you take those leave and your employer's deciding that they're not going to let you come back to work, again, contact us, because they must allow you to return to work. Your employer cannot just say, I'm sorry, you've been on maternity leave, I've given your job away to somebody else, you haven't got a job now, because that would be an unfair dismissal, and it would be discrimination on the grounds of maternity, and probably discrimination on the grounds of sex as well. So make sure you contact RCN. But those are the two key areas, I think, Tony. It's usually coming back to work after maternity and adoption, and usually somebody who's on long-term sick and the employer's threatening to end their employment.
Well, just a final question, conscious of time, and just a quick reminder for those of you that you haven't booked, if you want to book, I should say, for the next webinar on statutory pay, which Barry mentioned earlier, please go on where you booked this one to book the next session, the 7th of September. And finally, Barry, if you have exhausted your annual leave and switched jobs, are you also entitled to annual leave in the new job?
Yeah, it's 5.6 weeks annual leave per leave year with each employer. Now, but however, what you have to remember is that if you've taken, and that's something I didn't touch on because it gets into the realms of pay, but if your employer's leave year is, say, the 1st of January to the 31st of December, and your entitlement is 5.6 weeks, and you get to July and you've taken all of the 5.6 weeks, and then you're going to leave, your employer is entitled to claw back money from you equivalent to the leave that you've taken that you hadn't accrued. Because if you remember, I said that you accrue annual leave 1/12 during your first year of employment, but you also accrue annual leave during 1/12 per month during your last leave year of employment. Even though you start the leave year entitled to 5.6 weeks, if you haven't worked the full year, then you wouldn't be entitled to 5.6 weeks. So if you've taken more, you'd have to pay that back. You then go to your new employer and you start a new leave year with your new employer. So if your new leave year starts on the day that you start employment, then you start accruing leave each month. If you start halfway through your new employer's leave year, then you will only get the entitlement to half the leave year, half the entitlement, because you've only started halfway through the leave year. You would then need to wait until you've been there at the beginning of the second leave year to get the full entitlement.
Thank you, Barry, for amazing presentation and so informative. Anyone with any issues, please, you can either call RCND or email us via RCND. And just to remind everyone, 7th of September, we look forward to seeing you there. Take care, everyone, and have a great evening. Bye now.